Okay. And look at that. We've got 75 participants already, and they will flood in for about a minute while I let them come in, and then we'll officially start.
Okay.
You've been traveling a lot, haven't you? Up and down the
Yeah.
country.
Are we on air now or where?
We're on air. I'm just doing some on-air banter
On
before
air banter,
we.
lovely. I've been to Sydney, then back to Melbourne, then back to Sydney, then to Brisbane. I'm getting lost. Anyway, I've been to Sydney a few times. I've been to Melbourne, Brisbane. Maybe that's all, but I'm in South Australia next week
Okay.
and Perth the week after that. So yeah, it's been a pretty good tour.
Very good. Well, you will have earned your Christmas break by then.
It is beginning to feel that way. Because you really you finish the essay, it's sent to the printers, and you're immediately on the publicity trail.
Mm,
That's quite an intense schedule.
yeah. Well, I think we've got a good number of people who filtered in, and people will continue to filter in. So let's get started.
Okay.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Alice Grundy. I'm managing editor of Australia Institute Press, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you today to Australia's biggest book club. I'm coming to you from unceded Ngunnawal and Ngambri country. I'm really grateful for the Aboriginal people who have taken care of this country for many, many millennia and continue to do so. So you can register for upcoming Australia Institute webinars on our website, australiainstitute.org.au. And just some Zoom tips. I know we have a lot of regulars, but just in case you're not familiar, you can type in questions for Sean using the Q&A box, and you can upvote other people's questions too. Remember to keep things civil and on topic in the chat, or else we'll boot you out. And this is a live event, and it is being recorded. The video will be available on our website after. That's australiainstitute.org.au. So, our guest today is Sean Kelly, the author of The Good Fight: What Does Labor Stand For? And this is a pretty significant quarterly essay because it is issue number 100. You will be familiar with Sean's work from things like the Sydney Morning Herald and the Monthly, and also from his book The Game, A Portrait of Scott Morrison. He's also been a former advisor to Labor prime ministers, which I think we'll get a chance to talk a little bit about. Welcome, Sean.
Thanks for having me. Hi, everyone.
So, how about we start with where we are right now? It's been a pretty intense last sitting week in Parliament. In particular, at the Institute, we've been talking quite a bit about the passage of the EPBC, the Environmental Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act. What's your read on how this last week has gone, the negotiations that the Labor Party has undertaken with the Greens? It could have been with the coalition, but this is the way things have landed. What's your assessment?
Look, I'll be perfectly honest and say that I have been absolutely wrapped up in talking about this essay. I've honestly done 100 things in the last week or so. So my mind is not entirely in federal politics. It will be by the end of today when I have to try to pull a column together.
Ah,
But my initial take is that it is really interesting that Labor ended up doing a deal with the Greens. That there was discussion, there were signs early on that the government wanted to do a deal with the coalition. Those were the noises we were hearing, that it preferred to do a deal with the coalition over the Greens. And that is in keeping with something I write about in the essay, which is this attempt by Labor, I think, a lot of the time to please business, to go out of its way to not ruffle business's feathers, and to do so. And Richard Dennis of the Institute has written about exactly this, that it tends to give away its power. It tends to say we need bipartisan support. We need the Liberals on board that will embed this for the long term. And in doing so, it essentially hands over negotiating power to its opponents, the Conservative opponents. And on a bill that was to do with the environment, I mean, the Greens were making this point, but it was a pretty sensible point. It seemed pretty crazy that Labor wanted to do a deal above all with the party that has just come out opposing net zero. There was obviously a logical gap there. But for me, the most significant thing is that Labor abandoned um, that idea it has had that it has to deal with the coalition, And that to me suggests it's not a lay down misere, it's not conclusive, but it's a hint perhaps that Labor is becoming a little bit more confident in itself, a little bit less determined to make nice all the time. And I
Mm,
think that's really, really interesting and potentially positive in terms of the chances of Labor getting some bigger things done this term.
mm. And that could be a point of difference from what was happening around the time of the productivity roundtable. And that's something that you write about in the essay. You said the aim of the summit seemed to be to reach consensus. Albanese told the Australian, if you had a choice between do you have things with more support or sorry, do you have less things with more support or more things with less broad support? Then I'm in favor of the former. Consensus can be useful, but that is a genuinely striking statement for the way it privileges the level of support for an idea over the quality of an idea or the importance of the problem being solved. So, can you talk to us a bit about the idea of consensus when it comes to policymaking and what you've seen so far in the first term and in the second term of the Labor government?
Yeah, I found that such an interesting statement when Anthony Albanese made it ahead of the Productivity Summit or the Economic Reform Summit or whatever the government finally decided it should be called, because it was essentially saying we want people to agree. And I think that's always a tricky thing in politics, but it is particularly a tricky thing when you are heading into a forum that is dominated by fairly powerful people, because these powerful people have a lot of experience negotiating. And to the point I was making before, I think in saying something like that, the government was giving away a very significant chunk of its power. And there are differing views on what that summit achieved. It could be that the consensus that it reached on intergenerational equality or intergenerational inequality um, will end up being important. It is possible that Jim Chalmers takes that and tries to build on it. But at this early stage, you'd have to say the the summit hasn't amounted to much. And it certainly didn't amount to as much as was foreshadowed before it took place. Early on when it was announced, there was a real sense that, the Treasurer said he wanted to grasp the nettle on tax reform. And it didn't happen. And I'm not saying that's necessarily down to Jim Chalmers, but it is down to the government in general. There was clearly a view at the end that it was okay to come out with less as long as everybody agreed on it. And I think we do see this in this government a lot, and it comes back to something a simpler tendency, if you like, which is conflict aversion. It's not so much that they want consensus, it is that they are most of the time terrified of a fight. And they said that they would essentially say this. So I'm getting helicopters overhead. Um, they essentially said this privately in the first year of the first term. They would basically boast about not frightening the horses, by which they meant they would announce policy, but no one would really get upset. And at some point, I think when you're announcing policy, you have to ask, well, why is nobody getting upset? Does it perhaps mean we're not actually making significant changes? Now, the government would say they are making small changes, and those small changes add up over time. And you know what? If they are in power in the end for 15, 20 years, that could well be the case. Uh, but otherwise, I think it is difficult to make significant changes without conflict. And the biggest reason for that, to me, is that inequality is one of the two largest issues facing our society, I think. And the thing about inequality is you can't challenge it without either taking things away from people or at least slowing the accumulation of wealth by those who already have significant wealth. And if
Mm.
you do either of those things, you're going to annoy a bunch of people. You're going to annoy a bunch of powerful people with the resources to run significant campaigns. And the fact that we haven't seen that is a pointer to the fact that government hasn't been willing to tackle those issues. And if the government continues to be unwilling to tackle those issues or unwilling to do things that will provoke a fight, then we're just not going to see those issues dealt with in any significant way.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the interesting points that you make in the essay is that while it might be possible to set lower targets that are more achievable for the electorate, if you're looking at the government, then a small achievable target that doesn't make a difference to your life, you know, what's the point? And the danger with big targets is that maybe you don't achieve it, but what's the point of only having small targets that don't change people's lives? I'm interested in what you're saying about conflict, and you talk a bit about Keating and use him as a counterpoint to Albanese. Um, that Keating was quite happy with conflict. Do you think that maybe there will be an increased appetite for conflict going forward now that we've seen the passage of this EPBC? Maybe that will embolden the government a little bit.
There were signs of green shoots in the first term when the government broke its promise on the stage three tax cuts, and that seemed like a significant thing. And there were people, including myself, who wrote columns saying this could be the start of a new willingness by the government to have fights when it needs to. And we didn't really see that happen. So I think we need to remain cautious, and that's really one of the tricky things with the government's approach, incrementalist approach. I think it often makes this argument for doing small things or for waiting. It has these little jumps, like with the EPBC this week, and then it slows again. And the argument it makes is have patience. Just wait. You will see that over time these things build. And on some level, that sounds absolutely reasonable, and it might be. And also, it means the date at which you're permitted to call the government out on not really doing enough kind of forever moves off into the distance. And, I think this is a trap for the government. I think it's a trap for the MPs because it can sound like a politically convenient thing for them. But I worry for them that they'll get a few terms in, they'll finally lose power. They'll have been telling each other, just wait, and that they'll kind of look around on election night and think, oh God, we're still waiting and it's too late now.
Mm. And if you'll forgive me a really quick plug, Australia Institute Press's new anthology, A Time for Bravery, is coming out. There are a lot of people writing essays in this book, especially on the topic of climate change, saying waiting isn't really an option right now. Um, I'm interested in a comparison that you make in the essay between Albanese's touchstone being kindness and John Howard saying that he wanted people to feel relaxed and comfortable. Um, but then you talk about a lot of unaddressed issues, so a lack of inheritance tax, government funding for private schools, private provision of care services, capital gains tax exemptions being one of the single largest contributors to global warming through fossil fuels. How do you square these two things of wanting to be a government that espouses kindness and inaction on these really pressing issues that are affecting people's lives?
Yeah, look, great question. Um, I think one of the things I should say about this essay is it's not, it's not a fierce attack on the government, nor is it a fierce defense of the government. It comes from a place of struggle within myself to try to work out what I think of this government. Because the truth is, and I write this in the essay, there are times when I look at the things they're doing and I think these add up, and this is important, and that block is important, and you put them together and you have a house. And there are times I look at them and I just throw my hands up in despair, and I think they're really never going to get anywhere. One of the things that gives me a little bit of hope is the way that Anthony Albanese talks about kindness. And he did this during the election campaign. He said in one of the debates, kindness isn't weakness. And I think that's quite a significant thing for a prime minister to say, especially at a time when the phrase strong man is on everybody's lips. And that is clearly one model for leadership around the world. Uh, and he said on election night, he talked about kindness being an Australian value. And I do think this is a really interesting thing because, you mentioned John Howard. One of the things John Howard did as Prime Minister was he reflected back a version of Australians to ourselves. And that version, or one of those versions, was relaxed and comfortable. And by doing that over 12 years or so, I think he brought the nation closer to that reality. And I think that is the power of a prime minister's rhetoric. And it is also the power of a prime minister's policy, because policy needs to match your rhetoric. And so I definitely think Anthony Albanese's rhetoric is interesting. I think it's personal. I think he really believes it, and I think it's important. And yeah, it needs to be matched by some other things in exactly the areas that you were listing before. And I think this in turn comes back to a really big uh, difficulty in our politics, which is that I think many people now feel worried uh, in their bones about the state of society. And some of that you can see in things that might seem trivial, like the fact we're all on our phones too much. But that ties to a wider trend which we've been seeing for decades, which is atomization, loneliness, the breakdown of identity, the breakdown of collectivity and community. And then alongside that, you have really uh, substantive factual points about the problems in our society, many of which, most of which relate to inequality. Uh, Essentially segregation in our schooling system, a schooling system which, I was horrified when I discovered this, doesn't shrink the gap between advantaged and disadvantaged students over the course of a student's career in school. It widens that gap, which is horrible. It's the opposite of what a schooling system should be doing. Um, the housing inequality, I think, is obvious to pretty much everybody at this point. And those things, the reason I talk about the feeling that something is not right is because while those facts are really important, it is also important that they are giving people this sense that something is really not right. And some people feel that in a very explicit way and they walk around angry about that, and some of them feel it in a more latent way. But I think that sense is growing. And one of the things that Anthony Albanese talks about when he talks about not making big promises, he says, oh, we can't make big promises because if we make big promises and then we don't achieve them, then that will lead to disillusionment. And then he talks in the aftermath of an election about the importance of delivering on election promises. And again, he ties this to keeping faith in democracy. I really don't think faith in democracy, which has been on a falling trend line for a while now, has been going down because governments haven't been delivering on a contract with people, because the society that is being produced, I think, is raising real questions for people about whether this is the type of society that we were promised. And so I think that is really the task of governments that want to restore faith in democracy at this point, to actually look around at the troubles, many of them relating to inequality. Because the thing about inequality is that while 20 years ago it was a kind of phrase that people on the left would use, and they largely meant that there were people in poverty, it is now becoming one of the defining features of society, with kind of two halves of society and a chasm in between them. And that is actually a shift in the shape of our country, and that's what governments need to come to terms with.
Mm. One of the questions that you ask in the essay is, we look to America and a lot of people are horrified by what we see there. And a question you ask is, what if Australia is just 20 years behind America?
Mhm.
What if we're on this trajectory of increasing inequality and we're going to end up like that? So, I mean, if you'll forgive me for asking if you can look into your crystal ball, uh, how straightforwardly are we heading down that path? And what kinds of changes do you think would need to be made to avoid it?
Look, I was really struck when I was reading a book about politics by the American philosopher Richard Rorty, of something he wrote 27 years ago. And he said the Democratic Party has moved into a sterile vacuum called the center. It has stopped talking about redistribution entirely. Um, what this will lead to in 20, 30 years, at some point in the future, sorry, he was saying, is a strongman will come along. There will be an overclass in society. The economy will be run by the super rich. Uh, his phrase, jocular contempt for women, will come back into fashion. I think that is putting it pretty mildly. And racial slurs will spread. And we have seen all of those things in America. And that sense of the centre left party in the country moving into a sterile vacuum called the centre and avoiding redistributional politics, um, is certainly not alien to the way we would think about our politics right now. So, to your question, how linear a road are we on to that point? I don't know. It is incredibly interesting that Andrew Leigh, a Labor frontbencher, uh, has said that we are a generation away from American style inequality. I think I think that the political class here makes a little bit of a causation correlation mistake. We think, well, things are relatively okay in this country. Our politics are relatively stable and relatively clustered around the center for, you know, with some for better and worse, but they're relatively clustered around the centre. And we also have compulsory voting and a strong Australian Electoral Commission. Therefore, those are the reasons, and therefore it will always be like this. Uh, but if inequality is actually the cause of instability and the cause of the growth in fringe politics and extremist politics, then there is no reason Australia should be immune from that. And as a friend of mine said, and this is a general life principle, but it applies in this case, that the moment you begin thinking that you are the special one, that you alone have the secret ingredient that will keep you safe, uh, is the moment you should really begin to doubt yourself.
I think a lot of people were quite shocked to see One Nation polling at 18%, according to that I think it was a news poll this week. A bit of a wake-up call for some people, perhaps. Um, I wanted to ask about um, shifting from, writing your book about Morrison and focusing on the coalition to writing about Labor. And you've been on the inside, you've been a Labor staffer. Could you talk about, well, first of all, what the shift was like, going from writing about the Morrison government to the Albanese government, and second of all, how your experience as a staffer informed your perspectives on what you've been writing.
I mean, look, in a sense, the shift of writing from Morrison to writing about this government is not that great in that it's a similar method, if you like. I'm trying to look at what those governments have done, and then I'm also trying to look at the words that they use to describe what they've done, and try to trace the connections between those two things and the gaps between those two things. Um, I mean, a significant difference is that this is, I think, by anybody's reckoning, regardless of your ideology, unless you're really determined to be blindly partisan, this is a better government than the Morrison government. It is more focused on at least some of the problems which the country is facing. It is dealing with actual things. I was discussing with someone the other day the way the Morrison government would kind of manufacture debate so that there was something to talk about in Parliament because it actually had no legislation at significant points, no laws to pass. There was that kind of emptiness. It had some achievements as well, but I think it was a government of a mark. The difference in a way is that examining this government, I think, is a much more uh, Morrison book, I guess, ended up more psychological.
Before we go to questions from the audience, and I can see that there's already quite a few lined up, ready and waiting, I just wanted to talk a little bit about your writing. I mean, at times, this is quite a personal essay where you're talking about your experiences, but also in terms of the style, you love a dinkus, the little asterisk that marks a space between paragraphs. It made me think a little bit of somebody like Joan Didion. And from your references, I mean, you mentioned Richard Rorty, there's Gramsci in there, but there are also writers, people like Ben Lerner, Elena Ferrante, Italo Calvino. Um, what's your input like when you're writing something like this? I mean, obviously you're citing people like Frank Bongiorno and Richard Dennis's Dead Center essay, but you've also clearly read quite widely. What's your writing and reading process like when you're working on an essay of this sort?
Um, Look, I often have in my mind the phrase, I think I take it from Michael Hoffman, who is a literary critic, who I think the phrase is a well-furnished mind. And so I think my answer is that while you have to do a lot of linear reading for a work like this, that once you are really deeply immersed in thinking about something, you can read almost anything and you will start to see parallels between whatever you're reading and the work you're doing. And I think that that's really interesting because the problem with linear reading, by which I mean reading directly on the topic that you're writing about, is inevitably when you're writing about zeitgeisty things, as I am here, uh, lots of people are having the same thoughts, and that's useful because often they're right and you can draw on them, and you want to be pushed in other directions as well.
I thought we'd switch to the question and answer section now. And I gave my version of an answer to this, but yours will be better. This is from Jock Churchman, who asks, to what extent and in which areas are the shortcomings of the Albanese Labour government attributable to the obligations they have to their financial donors?
Yeah, look, this is a really good question, and it's one I get a lot, and I think it's something that people are really worried about, and rightly so. Of course, donations are given. We always have to go back to common sense principles. Why are donations given? Donations are given because people expect something back. They expect a return on their investment. They're not, big businesses are not making donations out of the goodness of their heart. Now, I don't mean that politicians therefore engage directly in a corrupt quid pro quo, but it is part of allowing those powerful interests, often powerful business interests, to swim in the same waters. And I think this is actually a more influential fact. I think you just end up with a situation in which politicians and very rich people end up in the same room together. And if you can get in the ear of a politician and people talk about Donald Trump, the last person he spoke to is the most influential person on him. Now, that's not true for a lot of more sensible politicians, but a similar principle applies. If a certain type of person is speaking in their ear more often than other types of people, then those people who are getting in their ear are just going to weigh a little bit more on their mind. That's human nature. And so that's the real difficulty. It's not exactly the money per se, but it is absolutely the access that money often purchases.
Mm. Question from Kev Arms, who asks, have the amendments to the EPBC increased or reduced environmental protection? Expecting a line-by-line deconstruction of the legislation here, Sean. And how much power responsibility has been flicked to state governments?
Look, I'm sorry, I have no answer on this. I'm getting into the final shape of the deal later today, but I'm just the wrong person to ask at this point.
Yeah. There's some good coverage on The Point. Thepoint.com.au is the Australia Institute's new website, so I can recommend checking it out there. Chelsea Honeyset asks, do you have a sense that the Albanese government is saving up their power for something specific, or is it just general risk caution?
Great question. This is one of the reasons I struggle with them, with what to think. In the first term, Anthony Albanese did the difficult things in the second year. He did the broken promise on the stage 3 tax cuts, and he campaigned for the voice. And that was very deliberate, I think. It meant that if they had both gone pear-shaped, and one of them obviously did, that there would still be a year before the election date in which he could politically recover. And that is essentially what happened. And prime ministers tend to get into habits. They find something that works for them and then they repeat it. So I think there is a possibility that we will see this government in its second year follow a similar trajectory as in its first term. So I'm really interested in that. It's not very far away, the start of that second year. It's pretty much, just after we come back from our summer holidays. The other interesting fact there is the government, and Albanese in particular, has come back after the election more confident. Now, you would expect that. A prime minister after their first victory is typically more confident. And everybody says that there's just something else as well. There's a spring in Albanese's step. And I think that could mean two entirely different things, unfortunately, for certainty. One is that he is more confident and therefore is emboldened to try a couple of more difficult things. The other is that he thinks his caution has worked really, really well. It served him well at the election. All of the people who critiqued that caution were wrong, and therefore he's emboldened to be even more cautious. But I don't know which one it will be.
Mm. The difficulty with that caution is all the people in the meantime who are struggling with things like trying to buy a house or getting care for their elderly parents or whatever it may be. Yeah. Claire Bettington asks, is climate change the elephant in the room? That's quite an open-ended question. How would you like to respond to that?
No, it is because, and the Australia Institute obviously focuses on this a bit. We don't really talk about what's happening on climate change very openly in this country. I think there's a slowly dawning recognition in much of the media that the export of fossil fuels that Australia is so dominant in at a global level, we're in the top 5 exporters, perhaps the second according to some statistics, of fossil fuel emissions. That is a crazy statistic, but we don't count that, of course, when we're talking about Australia's domestic emissions. And so it kind of just fades away from the debate. But I say that there's an increasing recognition in the media. I do see it just crop up in articles a bit more. And that's the way facts slowly make their way to the centre of the debate. So I'm intrigued to see whether that changes. It is the elephant in the room because it is one of the areas that the government points to as its most significant achievements. The government says this is a massive economic transition, it is a massive energy transition, it's a massive climate transition. And if Australia does well in that, then it will be correct on all 3 fronts. But there's a very, very, very large question over whether Australia is doing very well on that, or whether A, we're ignoring the exports, and B, we're getting a very long way in our calculation of emissions by relying on land use, which is not particularly reliable at this point. And so I think the reason I say absolutely yes, it is the elephant in the room, is because it's actually a central question about whether this government is a reforming government or not. And it's actually very, very difficult to come to a very clear answer on this. And again, this comes back a bit to the problem with incrementalism, that we're continually promised things will shift at some point down the track. And we're hearing that even now. There was a report out today that the government's not on track for its 2035 emissions targets. And the government says, well, there'll be more policy down the track. And, that's in part a legitimate answer and in part it's a worrying answer.
Mm. And if you look at those graphs, Greg Jericho had some good graphs yesterday about those results, and the trajectory is just not looking good. There's going to have to be a precipitous drop if we're going to meet those targets. Carol Bunt asks, in terms of addressing inequality, why doesn't the Albanese government increase job seeker allowance and other welfare payments? It seems like an obvious fix for some of the most vulnerable. Instead, Burke and Plibersek are planning to cut Centrelink payments to people who are under suspicion of committing a crime. Are they trying to outflank the right with even worse punitive policies?
I don't think they're trying to outflank the right, but I do think they are trying to protect themselves against attack from the right. It was horrible to see. There was a really polarized debate, a debate that kind of the two sides didn't really see each other after job seeker was raised in the first year of the government. It wasn't raised by a huge amount. Much of the media saw this as a positive thing, and then much of the rest of the media saw this as a hugely negative thing. And I remember watching Vox Pops after the budget on the commercial news channels. So we're not talking Sky here, on the commercial news channels, with people talking about dole bludgers and whatnot, getting more money at a time when everybody was doing it tough. And why did they deserve that? So this comes back to that question about the government's fear. I think the government is worried. I think the government is overly worried about doing things. And I think it's been particularly frightened off by the inflationary environment. And on some level, I can understand that, and not in relation to job seeker. I think it's pretty awful that those rates haven't been raised more significantly by a Labor government in its first term, because it means that those people have really, really suffered during an inflationary crisis. At a broader reform level, though, I can see why the government didn't, was held back by inflation in the first term. The difficulty, the worrying thing, is that inflation is still an issue now. So I think there's a question as to how long the government holds off, worried about that situation. Or to put this another way, if the government is willing to jump at that shadow, is it just always going to find shadows to jump at?
Sean Grogan asks, we hear about not scaring the horses, but I have to ask if the horses, in this case the general public, are not jittery, but rather bored out of their minds, completely uninspired.
Yeah, look, I think there is something to this, and I think the government felt a bit of this towards the end of its second year. Before we were in an election year, there was dissatisfaction among voters, and a fair chunk of that can be put down to inflation. But I also think there was a sense of the government being a bit flat-footed and not having held out things to do. And one of the things I write about in the essay is the way that I think the left has become embarrassed about stating what it believes, or at least centre-left governments have. And that means that they don't talk about ideals. They don't talk about endpoints. They don't talk about what they're trying to do. One of the things I write about in the essay, one of the things I noticed, is that Anthony Albanese's rhetoric about what he wants to do is often framed in the negative. For instance, the most famous one, he talks about not wanting to leave anybody behind. Nobody left behind, nobody held back. So it's not something that he wants to do. It's something he wants to make sure doesn't happen. You saw this with the Australian way, which sounds like a positive doctrine, progressive patriotism, but was actually about not becoming more American, not copying the ideologies of other nations. You can see it in I like fighting Tories, again, defining yourself by the enemy. And when he was asked what that meant earlier this year, Anthony Albanese said it means not giving up the gains that have been made. And in both of those examples, what he's talking about is making sure Australia stays as it is. Making sure we don't become more American, making sure we don't lose the benefits that we already have. And those may be worthwhile aims, but there's a really interesting political shift there, which is that is the way Conservatives have normally talked about preserving the status quo. And so absolutely, I think there is a danger for this government that they don't grab people. I think that is a problem because if you don't explain to people where you're heading, it is more difficult to take them there. And also, if you don't explain where you want to head to people, then when a crisis comes along, when a really genuine crisis comes along, you risk being defined entirely by that because you haven't defined yourself in any way. And I think both of those things remain real dangers for this government.
Yeah. Fitting into that is a question from Todd Winther, who says, whatever your opinion of the coalition ideologically, they've been transparent about what they actually believe. Is the inability of Labor to define itself in the 21st century leading to the erosion of policy development and the evolution of current policies in areas such as education, the NDIS, and housing?
Look, definitely. One of the really interesting things about the right, and obviously the right is heading in different directions across the world, but one thing many of the right-wing parties have in common is that they are departing from the kind of neoliberal consensus. You can see that in Donald Trump's tariffs, say. But the point is they're turning their back on the kind of worship of markets and the worship of neoliberal economics that we have seen dominate our politics for the last 30 or 40 years. And as the right begins to attack institutions, you can see the centre-left party swing in to defend those institutions. And I think that's all very well and actually very important when you're talking about democratic institutions, the Australian Electoral Commission, the courts. But it inevitably has shifted or has spread into defending all institutions. And I think that means that the centre-left parties have often found themselves in this situation where they are, again, essentially defending society as it is. And I think that does really limit your ability to think about how you might shift the world. And for me, the most obvious example of this, and it is very difficult to shift, is the way we rely on the private sector for aged care and childcare. Now, absolutely difficult to shift, but we have seen huge problems because of the profit motives that have dominated both of those sectors, absolutely massive problems. And what's really interesting about that is that most people are increasingly reliant on both aged care and childcare in their lives. And so I'm really interested to see whether, as those sectors become more involved in all of our lives, whether people begin to question the models that are driving those current setups. And I really think they could. And I really think that's something governments need to think about getting ahead of, rather than, for example, establishing an entirely new universal childcare system, which may have some very, very positive attributes to it, but without seeing where the childcare sector might need to be in 20 years.
Mm. Yeah, and tying into that is this question from Patricia Farrer, which is a sort of crystal ball type question. Do you believe that the Labor government will be brave enough to reduce funding for private schools, remove tax concessions for religious sects, tax fossil fuel companies, all in order to reduce social inequalities?
Yeah, that is such a good question. You would say it is doing a little bit of that. Obviously, you have one of the government's proudest achievements is delivering on the Gonski funding reforms. And this gets to the heart of the questions I think we should all be asking about the government. The Gonski funding reforms, absolutely an important thing to do, absolutely means more money for public schools, less imbalance between public and private schools. In some states, those funding reforms do not take full effect until 2034, which means that there are kids starting school this year who will not receive the full funding they're supposed to get for a decent education until their schooling is almost over. Now, that just makes it very hard to know exactly whether this government is really making the changes that it claims to want to make. And, you are making choices when you choose to delay funding like that. You are spending money elsewhere. And I write about this in the essay. This is the great contradiction between that phrase, holding nobody back and leaving nobody behind. The holding nobody back often means we're going to continue supporting policies that enable people to get richer faster, and a particular class of people, that is asset owners, because we're talking about tax breaks for superannuation, tax breaks for house ownership. We can't maintain all of those tax breaks, support for so-called aspiration, at the same time as making sure we fund the things like well-funded public schools that actually stop nobody being left behind.
Yeah, and in the Vantage Point essay by George Williams that we just published, he was talking about the NAPLAN results going backwards. So Australia might be a wealthy country in some ways, but our education system definitely needs some pretty serious help. There's a question from Peter Newbound, who asks, why does Albanese make promises? The promise to maintain stage 3 tax cuts was disgusting, mainly benefiting politicians and others in the top 2%. And The Voice, it looks like he wants kudos before the outcome.
Look, I think you have to make promises. I mean, partly you're pushed into them. You're going to be asked questions about what you are going to do. You have to have some answers to at least some of them. So I don't think politicians can avoid making promises. And I also think that making promises can actually be a really useful tool, not just politically, but to get governments to do things. Governments can make promises and excite people. And also sometimes if they are brave in the promises that they make, then they kind of compel themselves to do the things they've promised, to do some big things, perhaps bigger things than they will achieve if they don't actually say anything at all. I think my critique in a way would come from the other direction. It would be to say often this government, and Anthony Albanese is very explicit about this, chooses not to promise things because it's worried about disappointing people if they're not delivered. I think the result of that is it tends to be that you just keep expectations pretty low and you don't, you're not whipping your own back, so to speak.
Speaking of bold promises, Lauren Granger Brown asks, why should the Labour government be frightened of making really bold and radical policy when it has such a huge majority? And at a time when the opposition is a total shambles, they are unlikely to have this chance again. Why do they need the opposition's approval? John Howard didn't, Gough Whitlam didn't. I think they just want to stay in power for power's sake, and that will lead us nowhere at a time when we need real leadership.
The government's answer to that would be, in the words of Wayne Swan, that their support is wide but shallow. Their primary vote remains low. They don't take anything for granted. But look, I tend to agree with you. They have a huge majority. Seeing that the chances of them losing government at the next election are vanishingly low. It can happen. Of course, it can happen. But it's not likely. This does seem like a really massive opportunity. But that is why I do keep an open mind as to the second year. There is another alternative. A young man came up to me this week and said, what if they make a bunch of bold promises before their third term, knowing they'll get elected, and then they'll be able to say they have a mandate. I don't think that that's what will happen, but I think there is a grain of possible truth in there, which is that maybe they do some things in the second year. Maybe they do hold a couple of things back as promises for that third term. Anthony Albanese is talking about universal childcare in that vein as a promise to make before the third term. So I think they need to use this opportunity, but it is early in the term to arrive definitively at a conclusion that they won't.
Mm-hmm. Another very big question, but a short one. Tom Gersbach asks, speaking about First Nations, what's next for Labor? I mean, you talk a little bit about the voice in the essay, and we've seen treaty passing in Victoria. What do you see coming up at a federal level?
There are little noises that are seeping out about the possibility of them doing, I guess, exactly what I've been talking about, which is to do a bit more on this particular topic in that second year. So Anthony Albanese talks about this first year as the year of delivery, and then maybe he'll do something different in the second year. And I think it will be tremendously disheartening if they don't do anything on Indigenous affairs in that second year. There was a lot of confusion about Anthony Albanese's comments about Makarrata, and what he was actually suggesting the government will do. It sounded a lot like, at the start of this term, like he was departing from the government's commitment to the Uluru Statement from the Heart, but unclear. So, this is the difficulty. Like so many things, it is very much a question in progress, which is a little bit less hopeful than a work in progress. I think it will, I think after the Voice result, there is a real onus on this government to do something significant. And I don't mean a big, constitutional question. I mean, to really invest heavily in making the economic and opportunity changes that it says it wants to make.
I think we
in
can
Indigenous communities.
I think we can just squeeze in two more questions. So one from Tony Simons asking, how can Albanese more effectively respond to Lee and Co.'s Trumpian dog whistle on immigration?
That is such a difficult question. I don't know if I have a good answer to that. I think by holding the line, essentially, and this is something Anthony Albanese is pretty strong on most of the time. He does really go into bat for Australia as a multicultural nation. Casting back in time from before he was leader, Labor was going to run an ad. I think maybe he had begun running an ad about putting Australia first and Australians first, and he spoke out against that, is my memory. And you can see in his statements as Prime Minister, when immigration has been raised recently, he will really defend the importance of immigration. So I think it's really important to keep on doing that, and to really be consistent in that and not take a backward step. And then the other element, it comes back to what I was talking about with inequality, and I think this is fundamental to everything. I think if you are going to ask people who are worried about immigration to continue to live with the levels of immigration that we have without becoming frightened. And obviously, I think they shouldn't, I think immigration is a great thing. I hate that it is used in scare campaigns. I hate that people get worried about it. But there is a segment of the community that is. And if the government is going to ask people not to be, then it needs to deal with other concerns that they have. And I think a lot of them are around inequality, whether or not they always realise it. And I think this is true in other policy areas. If the government is going to ask a lot of people to make adjustments as we transition towards net zero, then again, it needs to deal with inequality, because I think these are first order issues for a lot of people. And if the government can deal well with those things, then it will find its path cleared in other areas.
A last question from Michael Daytoner saying, why won't the government allow a conscience vote on gambling ads reform when a huge percentage of Australians are in favour of it?
Look, conscience votes in particular are a real source of contention in the Labor Party. They're very rarely used, and Labor has a very clear philosophy of power, which is that the power lies in the collective, and it is important that the collective sticks together. And you can have a really good debate about whether that's right, but I think it's an absolutely legitimate argument. So for me, the question is less about whether Labor should have a conscience vote and more about whether Labor should back in the gambling reform bans, gambling ad bans. And I think it is very strange that they're not really. I think this is one of the best examples of Labor giving in to corporate interests. And there was a report a couple of weeks ago that caucus MPs, Labor MPs, are many of them are very exercised about this. They want to do something about it, but they won't say anything privately and they won't say anything publicly. And the fact they won't say it in caucus, I think, is really concerning. And this is one of the main points I make in the essay, that you don't see much signs of this struggle between idealism and pragmatics in the Labor Party anymore. You don't hear much from caucus at all. And that's I think that's worrying. That's how you get the best results in a political party. That's why you have more than just, one man or the cabinet running the country. You have a whole government of MPs. You want to hear from them. You want the debate.
Well, I can recommend The Good Fight very highly, aside from the fact that it's insightful and a very useful way of trying to understand what's happening with the Albanese government. It's also really well written. So you should definitely buy it for friends and family for Christmas. And you should also buy A Time for Bravery, which you can find on the Australia Institute's website. It's got lots of big ideas for how to make the country better and what we might be able to achieve if we're brave. Thank you so much, Sean, for today. I'm sorry for the internet struggles, everybody, but I'm glad that we made it through in the end. Thank you for coming along and listening, and we'll see you next year for Australia's biggest book club. Bye.
Bye.
Thanks for watching. If you'd like to keep up to date with all our latest research and work, sign up to our newsletter. Delivered every fortnight, it includes behind-the-scenes updates from Richard Dennis, an exclusive cartoon from Judy Horacek, details for our upcoming events and webinars, as well as explainers, graphs, and not to mention the latest cutting-edge research and analysis from the team here on the key issues that are facing Australia. Click the button on your screen to check it out.